So it's just past 11. It looks like most people who are coming are here. So let's go ahead and begin today's class. I told you yesterday that at the start of each lecture, I'm going to give you 3 key concepts. These are going to be key concepts for the lecture and or for the readings that came with this lecture. So hopefully you did the readings last night and a couple of these look very familiar to you. We'll be talking about them today as well. But as I said, I'm going to start each lecture this way just so you have an idea of specifically what it is I'm hoping you're taking away from it. But before we get into talking about these 3 key concepts, I've got about a 6-minute video that I thought we would watch.
Being home. This is home. We can get fucked up and don't have to worry about it. Woo woo!
It's okay.
This is Juggalos for motherfucking family. Family! 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 Woo woo!
Juggalo is kind of the title that bonds us together, but the truth of the matter is that being from different walks of life and being from cultures that are so estranged from each other, you know, I feel like everybody takes their own little bit from it and, you know, adapts that to, you know, hey, this speaks to me and maybe that doesn't, you know, and somebody else might, you know, vibe with this and not so much care for that. But, you know, so you'll have juggalos that are, you know, maybe out here with their families, you know, trying to have a wholesome good time. You know, we meet straight edge juggalos. I mean, I'm not going to deny that there's not juggalo gangs out there, you know, but to call juggalos themselves a gang is a very big misconception, I think.
I first became a juggalo because my brother right here, I mean, I've known him for over 11 years now. You know, he's not my blood, but goddamn it, he'll be the closest thing I will ever have to blood. You know, and just the scene through kind people, you know, kind people that people look down upon because they listen to weird shit. They didn't like their music or their appearance, so they turned them away. This motherfucker's been turned away by not some of the so-and-so kind people, churchgoers. I go every Sunday, pay my dues, and they turn him down because of the way he looks and talks. This motherfucker has helped me pay my rent, took me in. He's done more shit for me than my own family. And that's how I became a juggalette, through family love.
It's a lifestyle, it ain't no music choice. It's a lifestyle. Fucking, you know, do what you gotta do. You don't fucking hate on people because they're different. You know, you see the difference in people and you just love them for whoever they are, you know? Anybody can come here and fucking have a good time.
Me, personally, I can't describe what a juggalo is. They're a special breed. They're just, I love them. I just love them. Like, I can't. Like, they're just so carefree and free-spirited and they don't give a fuck. It's what I love. It's what I love. Yes. I do whatever the fuck I want and don't give two fucking shits. I don't know about the party. I haven't quite moved from the car in a while since, because I am fucked up on E and vodka. Yes. Oh yeah, right there.
The only way I got that vomit off me was to get in the fucking rain. I got fucked up. I was drinking Caribou on the fucking carnival rides and fucking got fucked up. Apparently, I fucking passed out and then my fucking homeboy fucking shows up out of nowhere and gets me back to the fucking tent. And apparently I fucking fell out in the middle of the road. Apparently I had motherfuckers come up to me and ask me how I am. That's how bad it was. It was a fucking spectacle and shit. And I don't give a fuck because that was righteous. I'll tell you for real about being a juggalo, man. That shit made me the motherfucker I am today. Honest to God, man. If it wasn't from fucking Jay and Shaq, that shit would not be on. I don't want to fucking think the kind of motherfucker I'd be. I grew up to be a fucking decent, fucking good-hearted, good-natured motherfucker. I'm a fucking nice person. I can cook like a motherfucker, make some fucking straight-up fucking grub, fucking chicken fried steak, fucking collard greens, fucking mashed potatoes, all that fucking good-ass sausage gravy, biscuits, fucking everything, man. I cook like a motherfucker. I want to find a skinny-ass little bitch and make her fat, and we can lose weight together, and we'll bond.
My name is Maniac. First year of gathering. That's what's up. By myself, I'm a happy motherfucker. Living life day to day. Doing my thing. Maniac. Being happy. Doing fucking shit that she loves to do. Being crazy, being family. Being happy. Yeah, most people think I'm on drugs because I'm always happy.
Are you on drugs?
No, I'm not. I'm high on life. My voice is gone because I've experienced so much. So much fun times here and family love. Oh, are you serious? Oh, man. What I love to think about this is it's a puzzle. And each and every one of us is an integral piece that puts a big picture. And once we're all together, it puts a big picture. It lets us to see the big picture. Yeah. I'll tell you what a juggalo and a juggler is someone who's down with the clown until they're dead in the ground. What's up?
Actually, it really burns. I'm not gonna lie.
From the body or the face.
On the face.
Yeah.
No, you should never put spray paint on your face. Never put spray paint on your face. Oh.
Okay, so this is a documentary called American Juggalo. Obviously has nothing to do with Japan, but I want you to take a minute to think about what you just saw. Imagine that this was the image of America abroad. Imagine that if you're American, you go traveling, or if you're from another country, that you go home, and people everywhere you go ask you about, what are your feelings on the Insane Clown Posse? Right? Why aren't you wearing spray paint on your face? Right? Take a minute to think about what kinds of problems you would encounter if this is the way that people all over the world imagined America and Americans. Maybe even take about 1 minute, say hi to the person next to you. Tell them what you think, and then I'll ask a couple of you to tell us. Talk to your neighbors. So, how about you guys? What do you guys talk about? What did you think? So people wouldn't take Americans seriously. Americans would have to work harder to prove we're normal, good people, something like that. Okay. How about you guys? What did you talk about? Okay, so people would think, oh, maybe I would go visit there. It looks like they're having a good party, but I would never want to live there. Maybe parents would be afraid to send their kids to study abroad, something like that. How about you guys up here? Yeah, I saw you two chatting, yeah. Sure, so it would have political effects, not just personal effects for people, traveling abroad. It would have effects on the economy, on tourism, perhaps even on international relations. So I bring this up because I want to start today by talking about the kind of images of Japan that we find particularly in America, in the UK, in Europe. Let me start with a few websites that I found as I was searching recently. So this is Weird Japan. You can see the address weirdjapan.org. Here's japanisweird.com. Here's Only in Japan with an archive of WTF Japan. Here's a listicle, 25 weird things about Japan that'll make you say, but why? Reader's Digest, 10 crazy things you can only find in Japan. Ranker, most WTF Japan photos ever. Thrifty Nomads, 10 reasons why Japan is weird and wonderful. The Telegraph Travel, love hotels and cuddle cafes, 22 weird and wonderful things about Japan. Here's a YouTube video channel called WTF Japan Seriously. Another listicle, 17 crazy things that are only possible in Japan. BuzzFeed also is on board here. 29 pictures that prove Japan is the most WTF country on earth. And then if you actually go into YouTube and search, you can find 25 crazy things you will only find in Japan. By the way, this is from 2014. Then we have WTF Japan, the weirdest things only found in Japan. This one is 2017. And then June 2018, 15 facts that prove Japan is not like any other country. Are you noticing a pattern here? So this was something I thought was particularly interesting, that all of these videos are focusing on this photo of a woman who built herself a chin rest so she could rest on the subway. First of all, judging by her clothes, I'd say none of you were born yet when this photo was taken, right? And yet it's still being used in videos produced in June 2018. Right? Also, it's clearly the same photo again and again. This is clearly one lady who did one thing. Right? But we're very saturated, particularly online, with this kind of issues about weird Japan, WTF Japan. It's very, very easy to find these sites. They pop up in my Facebook all the time. And it's not just these lists, too. You find a lot of even New York Times articles, Guardian articles, BBC articles, and specials that talk about Japan as though it really is the weirdest place in the world. So in today's lecture, I'm going to kind of trace this weird Japan discourse backwards. We're going to start with the idea of Orientalism, coming from Edward Said, and talk about the politics of representation of Asia and how they've been problematic ever since colonial times. And then we'll use that to get into how that has been applied specifically to Japan and how that evolved into this discourse of weird Japan. And then we'll use that to talk about today's third key concept, which is Nihon Jinron, Japanese cultural nationalism. So we'll get into that in a minute. But let's start by talking about Orientalism. So Orientalism is the name of a book. It's the name of a theory. If you've taken any East Asian studies classes before, or any history of China or history of Japan or history of colonialism classes, also history of the Middle East, history of South Asia, you've hopefully come across this word already. But basically, this is Edward Said. This is his word for the way that the West has historically thought about and imagined the East, right? What he calls the Orient. So I'm going to go through his main arguments so you know what he's talking about. And I'm sorry there's going to be a couple big blocks of text up here, but bear with me. So first, the idea is that historically, starting from colonial and even pre-colonial times, representations of the East in Europe and later in the US have been based much more in fantasy, in Westerners' fantasy of what is happening in Asia, than in the actual reality of things happening in Asia. People have written about, talked about, described, even academically studied Asia from this fantasy perspective, rather than from grounding it in the experiences, in the lives, in the facts of what's happening in Asia. And because this is happening in a Western imagination, and that's the West that is colonizing Asia, there's a relationship here between the imagination and the colonization, right? In other words, if the West is in control of how Asia is represented, then that gives the West a form of power over Asia, right? If Asia is always portrayed as being in need of colonization, for example, then that makes it easier to justify that colonization. If Asian people are historically depicted as being undereducated or superstitious, then it makes more sense for the supposedly enlightened and logical Westerners to come in and dominate them. Right? So this whole system of not really talking about Asia, but talking about an imagined image of Asia, becomes a colonial technology, becomes a way to justify the domination of Asia. One of the ways that this is done is by saying that Asia is the opposite of the West. And we'll get more into this in a minute, but this is an important point, because by casting the West, or casting Asia as the opposite, then you can say, oh, well, Europe is modern, Europe is high-tech, Europe is enlightened, Europe is scientific. And that means Asia is none of those things, right? And of course, through all of this process, there's no opportunity for the actual people of Asia to speak out. And again, we're talking historically here, but this is still true in certain ways today, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But historically, this discourse completely excluded the voices of people in and from Asia, right? This was all about mostly white guys in Europe, some white women in Europe, talking about, oh, you know, Asia is so quaint and so beautiful and so traditional and so ancient. Typically, the kind of images that you get with Orientalism, as I said, it's always Asia as the opposite of the West. So you get that the Orient, right, Asia is traditional and unchanging, whereas the West is modern and progressive. The Orient is mystical, but the West is scientific. The Orient is feminine, but the West is masculine. The Orient is inscrutable, and the West is straightforward. And the Orient becomes this beautiful, wonderful, amazing place for Westerners to go and experience time travel, in a sense. They can go to this beautiful, colorful, traditional, amazing, mystical place, but they still get to be the main characters. So I have some examples of this, so you can see what I'm talking about. This is a little bit of a deep cut. I don't know if anybody knows the TV show Dark Matter. It is on Netflix. No? It's not the best example of this in terms of being famous, but I just love this image, right? So the story starts with a bunch of people who wake up on a spaceship with amnesia. On your far left is the robot that runs the spaceship. So why does the Asian guy have a sword? Right? It turns out he's actually the prince of an intergalactic Japanese ninja empire. But in the very first episode, everyone wakes up with amnesia, and the Asian guy immediately goes and picks up a sword and knows how to use it. Right? So this idea that, you know, connecting Asia to this more traditional, more past, oh no, he doesn't get a laser gun. Right? He gets a sword because Asia is the traditional, the past, the the unchanging. In a similar vein, you have this idea of the Orient as mystical. This is Doctor Strange. Did anybody see Doctor Strange? Right? So he's this scientist. He gets in a car accident. His hands are destroyed. He goes through, he's not a scientist. He's a surgeon. He goes through every possible Western scientific possibility to fix his hands. when they fail, he goes to Nepal and enters a magic monastery, right? Which is in Nepal. It's in Asia. It's not in New York, right? And it has this very Asian aesthetic to it, right? These people wearing robes and learning from a master. The master herself is portrayed by a white actress, and a lot of people actually had issues with that, but in the comic books, it's an ancient Tibetan man. The Orient is feminine. I don't know if we have any James Bond fans in here. When I was 13, I tried to watch all the James Bond movies. That's where I first encountered You Only Live Twice. Again, this isn't the most famous example, but I just really love this poster. This is James Bond's first time going to Japan. And there's a scene in the film depicted in this poster where he is greeted by a whole bunch of Japanese women who are very excited to give him a bath because they've never been with such a hairy man before, and they're really excited about how manly he is. The feminizing of the Orient is an extremely problematic thing. Many scholars have written about this in the way that it creates stereotypical depictions of Asian women and also Asian men, right? It results in Asian women being portrayed often as very servile, very passive, very dedicated, almost like, what's the word? They're usually called the China doll, right? The extremely passive woman who is so desperate to please her man. And this is very often told in the context of that man being a white man, right? That there's this implication that, oh, finally I've found a real man because the men around me aren't real, and so I'm ready to dedicate myself to this real masculine white man. The other side of this is what's called the dragon lady, the usually hypersexual but also very manipulative, evil, emotionless Asian woman. And the dragon lady stereotype, again, comes from this idea that, you know, her whole life she's been surrounded by these weak, effeminate Asian men who would do whatever she wanted, so she's grown used to controlling men. So then she becomes a villain against white men in movies. And you can still find these, even in some examples, fairly recently. The next one, the Orient is inscrutable, right? We have this image of the ancient master who speaks in puzzles, who never tells you what he's really thinking or feeling, right? So here's an image from Kill Bill 2. Again, we have a lot of mixing of these tropes here, right? Because, you know, she's wearing a hoodie, and look at what he's wearing, right? We still have this sense of the ancient kung fu master, the unchanging traditional China. But on top of this is this layer of the Chinese master as this puzzle, as this mysterious figure that no one can ever really figure out, or that never really says what he means, that is there to reveal mysteries. And then this last one, Asia as a colorful backdrop for Western characters, right? This is from Lost in Translation, and it's a movie about two white people enjoying Tokyo. But it does a lot to kind of make fun of the interesting parts of Tokyo, but also some of the people in Tokyo. But really, it's just a story about two white people in an interesting place. And this is also fairly typical, that particularly in Western media, when you have films or TV shows depicting Asia, it's very much like this, right? Very often, it's about James Bond or Scarlett Johansson going to Japan or to China. So, okay, we've gone through the tropes. Now I'm going to test you. I'm going to show you the preview for a movie that came out a few years ago. I'm going to ask you to see how many of these you can find and identify. This is a little film called The Wolverine. Perhaps you're familiar with the character. Oh, no, come back. Why?
Eternity can be a curse. The losses you have to suffer. A man can't run out of things.
Sorry, it starts in Canada. We'll get to Asia in a second.
Lose his purpose.
My employer is dying. He wants to thank you for saving his life. It's an honor to meet the Wolverine.
That's not who I am anymore. I didn't send for you only to thank you, Logan. I wanted to repay you. A gift to equal the life you gave me. You have struggled long enough. Our company can do anything. I can make you mortal. Not healing it before. What the hell is happening? What they did to me, what I am, can't be undone. Don't be so sure.
Okay. What did you see? Any Orientalist tropes that came through in that preview? A lot, for example. Kimono. Okay, why is that an Orientalist trope? Okay. So people in Japan do sometimes wear kimono today. So a kimono itself is not necessarily being Orientalist. It could just be Japanese people doing something Japanese people do. What do you mean? Yeah, that is true. That is what's happening in the society. You can see this combination of people embracing tradition. But that's not necessarily Orientalism by itself. Alone, a Japanese woman in kimono is not problematic. When might that be problematic? White people wearing kimono. That actually can be problematic, but that's a little bit different. That's cultural appropriation, and hopefully we'll find a chance to talk about that. But what else? What other signs of Orientalism do you see? Yes? That they're using swords. If you've seen this movie, and there's a little bit of it in the preview, there's a point where he's attacked by an army of ninja, and they're all using swords and bows and arrows. Right? That's a little bit different from wearing a kimono, right? Nobody is walking around Japan attacking people with swords today. And, that's not how you fight a superhero, right? You don't bring swords. Yes? So, imagine this was New York. Would people chase him with swords in New York? Right. Or if it was London, you wouldn't have knights in armor chasing him, right? So, yes, the idea is that this was made in 2013. In 2013, guns existed. So why are people using bows and arrows and swords? Anything else that you saw? Yes? There is kind of a feel to that, right? And it's coming from this ancient old man who's talking about honor and gifts and debts. So yeah, I think there's a little bit of that ancient master feel to it. Yes? Yeah, and that's the corporate headquarters. This company for some reason thought, oh, our corporate headquarters will be a castle on a mountainside surrounded by ninjas. Yeah, the first time you see her, she's carrying that sword. She walks right up to Wolverine. She's like, don't mess with those dudes. Yeah, there's a little bit of a dragon lady trope there. Anything else? Again, we have an example here of a Hollywood movie about a white person in Asia, where Asia provides this really beautiful, colorful, traditional backdrop for the action around this white guy and the things happening to him. So all of these things are iterations of this Orientalist thinking. If you want more examples of this, if I can get back to controlling. There we go. Music videos. Here's my list of music videos that tend to embrace a lot of these tropes. A lot of them are just the using Asia as a fun backdrop for white people. But there's other good examples in there too. Feel free to look these up, send me your comments, or if you know of a music video that you think fits this list that I haven't included, email it to me and I'll check it out. There are other problems of Orientalism too, besides just these tropes of opposites. One of them is that by saying Asia is Europe's opposite, it homogenizes Asia. It makes Asia all one thing. All of Asia becomes traditional. All of Asia becomes feminine. And this homogenization has some interesting effects, right? One of those that we can see is, if you've ever seen Memoirs of a Geisha, right? So this is Michelle Yeoh from Malaysia and Zhang Ziyi from China playing Japanese women. And all of the main actresses in this film were not Japanese, right? This is something that particularly Asian American activists have complained about a lot, representation in American films, where they just say, oh, what? It's an Asian actor. That's good enough, right? This sense that Asian cultures are interchangeable, that there's no difference between using a Chinese actor for a Japanese role and using a Japanese actor for a Japanese role, or vice versa. There's also this sense of Asia as becoming ahistorical, right? Part of the idea that the West changes and progresses and Asia is always traditional is the idea that there's this unchanging essence to Asian tradition. So, how many people have seen Inception? That's a pretty famous one, right? A few of you. So, Ken Watanabe, this guy, I think his name is Saito in the film, he's this Japanese billionaire businessman, right? And they go inside his brain. And what's inside his mind? This beautiful golden samurai castle, right? So again, we have a British director, Christopher Nolan, telling us that the inside of a Japanese person's mind is always samurai style, right? That first there's this shared Asian essence, and that this essence is unchanging. These things have historically been applied to Japan, and I want to talk a little bit about that next, about how these things relate specifically to Japan. You see from very far back, from not long after Japan opened up to receiving Western visitors, you see a lot of the China doll stereotype. There's the very famous Puccini opera, Madame Butterfly, which is about a Japanese woman who falls in love with an American, I think he's a sailor in the Navy. And she ends up committing suicide when he leaves her, but she's this perfect servant wife. But when we get into World War II, we see this, the idea of the inscrutable Asia again coming up. A lot of the World War II propaganda films talk about Japanese as kind of these homogeneous, emotionless, robot-like figures, right? That all that's really in their head is the emperor. And that because of that, they're all moving and acting like robots in this war, that they're not necessarily human, and that it's impossible to know what they're thinking because they're so alien and so robotic. After World War II, and of course we'll get more into that tomorrow when we talk about World War II, but after World War II, you have, in the 1980s, the emergence of this idea of the corporate samurai, right? Suddenly, starting in the 1980s, Japanese corporations become really big in the world economy, and America starts paying attention because they start threatening American corporations. And all these Americans are scrambling to figure out what is it about these Japanese companies that's making them so competitive. So of course they decide it must be this Asian essence, this traditional Japanese culture. Because it's much easier to say, oh, there's something special and Asian about them than it is to say, oh, they are better at business than we are. Today, we see this in images of Japanese men as effeminate, asexual otaku, right? If you're interested in this topic, of course, the optional reading for today by Perry Hinton is all about the construction of this image, particularly in the UK, right? But this idea that Japan is becoming this sexless nation because all of the men are dating video games and pillows instead of real women, right? That Japanese men aren't masculine enough for real women, or the Japanese men are inherently childish little boys who are afraid to talk to women, right? So we can see these kinds of Orientalist tropes coming through even today. But an important thing to note is that Japan itself does a fair amount of Orientalizing, right? Japan has had a stake in the world economy, or like a larger stake in the world economy than other East Asian countries for longer than they have. By Japan's reckoning, it modernized sooner than other Asian countries. And so that's put Japan in a position where it's been able to Orientalize as well. So this is, again, kind of a deep cut. I don't know how many of you were alive in 1989, but this was a popular anime back in the day where everything that's happening in China in this anime is very Orientalist, very ancient, and focused on martial arts and pandas. But we can see this a little bit today too in how the Pokemon games and anime currently, if you are a follower of Pokemon, right now the Pokemon world has gone to Hawaii. And Hawaii itself becomes subject to these Orientalist images in that it's portrayed as more ancient, less developed, more spiritual, more natural. And there's even hints of Hawaii kind of needing to catch up to Japan, right? Of the Pokemon version of Tokyo importing technology or exporting technology to the Pokemon version of Hawaii. So it's the same kind of image of this more traditional place with a spiritual essence rather than a progressive modern place. So I want to talk a little bit about how Japan ended up as a place that can Orientalize, and then connect this back to this discourse of weird Japan that I started the class with. I asked you to read the introduction to your Goto Jones textbook, right, where he sets up this idea of the question of modern Japan. I asked you, it's on the syllabus, don't look at me with those question mark eyes. He introduces the idea of modern Japan, right, as this question, right? How do we judge if it's modern, right? Do we have to say that modern equals Western? Are these two different things? Has Japan experienced modernity through Westernization or in opposition to Westernization, right? What is the relationship between these two terms when it comes to Japan? So we talked about this just a minute ago, right? We said that one of the big Orientalist tropes is that the West is the site of modernity, right? And this was helpful in the colonizing of Asia, right? The West could say, oh, well, we're modern, you're backwards, you're traditional. So we are the ones who should lead you into the future, right? This was the colonialist thinking. But Japan went through a very drastic process of modernization in the 19th century. And we'll talk a lot about that history tomorrow. But because of that, because Japan worked so hard to be the first Asian nation with a modern, or to be really the first Asian nation, but the first Asian country with a modern army, the first Asian country with a modern economy, the first Asian country to even win a war against a European power in 1905. This convinced many people in Japan that Japan should see itself as superior to Asia, that Japan should see itself as on par with the West, right? But then this creates a position where the West is saying, oh, well, you're Asia, therefore you're traditional, you're not modern. And Japan is trying to assert, well, we are modern. And in a way to do that, they kind of have to say, we're not Asia, right? They're not modern, we are modern. So one of the responses to being put in this position was Japan started to establish for itself a third position, right? That Japan isn't the West and Japan isn't Asia. Japan is just Japan. And therefore, there's something inherently unique about being Japanese. Hopefully you also read the Goodman homework. That was required. And the key term there is Nihon Jinron, right? This is the discourse, the ways of thinking that emerged from this idea of Japan is a third position, right? The idea of the Japanese being unique. So, Nihon Jinron, by the way, translates roughly to theories on the Japanese. Sometimes people call it on theories on Japanese uniqueness or theories of a Japanese essence, things like that. But basically, these kinds of theories are a form of self-Orientalism, right? That, like other kinds of Orientalism, they're homogenizing, they're ahistorical, and they create a mythology of Japan where Japan is set as opposite the West. But how does Japan become opposite the West if Asia is opposite the West? Well, Japan situates itself as not only unique, but as uniquely unique, as the most unique. Right? Sure, every country has its unique aspects, but Japan is unique for being the most unique. A little complicated, I know. And that this uniqueness to Japan becomes an inherent, unchanging, essential quality of Japanese people. There's a lot of famous claims that have resulted from this, and if you check page 65 of the Goodman reading, there's actually a chart comparing this kind of Japan versus the West in these claims, right? Some of the really famous ones are that Japanese society is organized vertically and Western society is organized horizontally, right? Or that Westerners are independent, but Japanese are dependent or codependent, that their identity is based on group affiliation rather than on individuality. And as Goodman points out, all of these claims are highly problematic. They're very much a kind of self-stereotyping. But these claims aren't just coming from Japan. There's also a whole history of Western scholarship that goes into establishing this kind of thinking about Japan. And that's part of why we see it today when we see these websites talking about weird Japan. The classic example of this is The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. This is a book written by Ruth Benedict. It came out in 1946, which means she was writing it during World War II. And in fact, she was commissioned by the Office of Military Intelligence to write a book basically as a way to understand the enemy during the war. So she wrote this book without going to Japan. She couldn't go to Japan. It was World War II. Instead, she worked with Japanese Americans. She watched a lot of Japanese films. She read a bunch of Japanese novels. She put together whatever sources she could find. And this became kind of the foundational text for Japan studies today. If you go back a couple of generations of scholars, this was the first thing that everyone read. Now, by my generation and by your generation, people read this book to critique it, to look for the kind of problems she's bringing up. But in the beginning, this was kind of the textbook on Japanese culture. And it made a lot of assertions about things like how the West has a culture of guilt, but Japan has a culture of shame. Right? So again, it's trying to set up these dynamics of opposites that both, put the two on different spectrums, and also they homogenize Japan, right? Everyone in Japan bases their decisions on shame rather than guilt. It also allows to create a kind of moral hierarchy, right? By saying that, Americans feel guilt, so when they do something wrong, they actually feel bad about it. But Japanese people have a sense of shame, which means they only feel bad if other people see them do something wrong, right? So there's a whole kind of hidden mechanic there that tends to create problems of this more Orientalist variety. Just a quick mention, as I said, this was the book that a lot of scholars grew up reading, but if you've watched Mad Men, any Mad Men fans? No? Too young? Okay. Here's Don Draper in Mad Men reading The Chrysanthemum and the Sword for an episode where he uses the great wisdom of this book to trick Japanese businessmen by playing on their sense of honor. It's all very Orientalist, I find. But it does, the fact that Mad Men is referencing this book shows something, I think, of the impact that this book had back in the day. So Scholars embraced this kind of talk. We had, as I said, the Chrysanthemum and the Sword talks about shame versus guilt. Others talk about, like sociologists wanted to talk about why Japanese businesses were succeeding so much. And as I said before, they decided they would look to Japanese culture rather than Japanese business practices. Even if you look at pop culture studies coming out of the 90s and early 2000s, people studying manga, back when manga and anime first became big hits in America, all of the scholarship isn't focused on what's the process of making manga or what's the process of marketing manga. It's all focused on what is it that's unique about Japanese culture that produces this kind of comic and makes it successful. So it's all very much focused on this idea of finding this special, unique, essential center to Japanese culture. We can see this, of course, in the way that Western media talks about Japan too. In the 1950s, Japan was exotic. The key image was the geisha. And the media talked about Japan as everything based on honor and shame and Bushido, the way of the samurai. When you get into 80s, it's all about corporate Japan. And everyone's talking about the Japanese style of group harmony and how this sense of group harmony and collective thinking and sacrificing the individual for the group is why the corporations are so successful. This picture probably won't make sense to any of you, and I apologize for that, but I'll explain it for a moment. Everybody knows who the Avengers are, right? Okay, and Spider-Man, right? Way, way back in 1993, when this kind of thinking about Japan was still really popular, Marvel Comics produced a bunch of comics about the Marvel universe in the year 2099. So they're talking about what is the future of our universe. And so you see this building is the Stark Fujikawa Global Headquarters. Stark, of course, being Tony Stark, Iron Man. Right? So in 1993, there was a sense that, in the future, even Iron Man's company will be owned by the Japanese. Right? So this is kind of just referencing this thinking. In the 2000s, pop culture Japan emerges, right? The idea of cool Japan, which we'll talk quite a bit about next week. But suddenly, Japan becomes part of this global consumer fad. People watching anime, people buying manga, people playing video games, people getting Hello Kitty tattoos. And at this point, this new discourse emerges of Japanese people as being hyper-mediated, as being pictocentric, right? Suddenly the new Nihon Jinron, the new way of imagining this essence of Japanese people is that Japanese people think in pictures instead of in words. And that's why they use kanji instead of letters to write. And that's why you can find, 11th century scrolls of rabbits and frogs playing together, right? And this is, of course, set up as a contrast to the logocentric West, where we think in words rather than in pictures. And then, of course, now we have the emergence of weird Japan, right? This discourse of Japan as the weird, freaky place where people marry video games. But it's not just Western media that's promoting this kind of thinking. I showed you this a few minutes ago, right? This BuzzFeed listicle about contributing authors to this is Daisuke Furuta. He is the head editor, the founding editor of BuzzFeed Japan. So you actually have a Japanese man playing an integral part in creating this image for BuzzFeed of Japan as weird. In fact, hopefully you noticed in Goodman that the Japanese government has played an active role in promoting this kind of thinking. One of the very famous books, the book about Japan being vertical and the West being horizontal, by Nakane Chie, I think it's called Japanese Society. And hundreds of thousands of copies of it were distributed to Western countries through Japanese embassies. That the Japanese government sent it to their embassies and said, give this to everyone so they can understand our society. You can also see examples. I recently listened to a radio interview, a radio show by Miura Jun, who's a Japanese critic and expert on subculture. And he was flown to the UK by the BBC because they said, oh, he's an expert on Japanese subculture. We want to interview him about otaku. So they flew him all the way to the UK. And they said, okay, show us your otaku stuff. And he said, okay, well, recently I'm really interested in Buddhist statues and Japanese festivals. And the BBC producers were like, no, that's not what we want. Talk about Gundam. And he's like, well, I'm not really a Gundam fan. I don't really know about Gundam. But his home office, who's paid for him to go to the UK for this interview, is pressuring him, you got to, produce something for the BBC. So he goes out, he buys a bunch of Gundam stuff, and he sits in a dark room. They have him sit in a dark room and hold a flashlight under his face for the interview and talk about things that he doesn't really care about. But he's complicit in this because he knows this is the image that they want, and this is what his office is telling him to do. This is what their office is telling him to do. So he becomes a participant in the construction of this kind of image. There's also a whole domestic aspect to this kind of Nihon Jinron. This is an Amazon search I did just a couple of days ago for Nihon Jinron, and then I ordered it by ranking. You can see it had over 4,000 hits on Amazon Japan for this genre of films. And these are the top rated ones. You have one about things that even Japanese people don't know about Japan that the world is celebrating. One about international Japanese people that the world is celebrating. This third one particularly interests me. It's written by these two American guys who happen to be very prominent figures in the efforts to deny the history of comfort women. And so they're producing this very nationalistic text about being proud of Japan. We'll talk a little bit more about them when we talk about the comfort women next Monday. And then the last one is kind or gentle Japanese language. And it's talking about the key terms or special words that express the kindness of the Japanese that are impossible to express in English. Right? And setting up Japan and Japanese and English as these two opposites to show that there's something special and essential about Japanese people. This linguistic approach is a really common one. The really famous book about Japanese people being dependent rather than independent. The whole book is based on the experience of a psychotherapist, a Japanese psychotherapist who was working with an American woman. And when she wanted to say her child didn't depend on her enough, she said it in Japanese. And he said, oh, why did you say that in Japanese? And she said, oh, there's no English word. And his conclusion was, oh, therefore, this feeling, this concept only exists in Japan. So this kind of linguistic reductionism, right? Taking something about the origins of a word and using it to say something about the essence of a culture. So hopefully you've picked up by now that I'm very critical of this kind of thinking, right? That this Nihon Jinron way of thinking, well, before I tell you, let me ask you, what do you see as the potential problems for this thinking of Japan as unique, as the opposite of the West, in fact, as uniquely unique? Right? Again, take 1 minute, talk to your neighbor, and I'll come around and pick on a few different groups this time. Ask you these two questions. What do you think are the possible problems that result from this kind of thinking? Oh, good. It got quiet. That's a good chance for me to come in and talk to people. How about you guys? What did you think? Okay, so recently the government's really trying to up tourism because the Olympics are coming up in Tokyo 2020. And so you see it as people arriving in Japan potentially armed with these stereotypes, so that's going to cause problems. What kind of problems do you see happening? Okay. So people are going to show up expecting to see a cosplayer on every street corner, something like that, and they're going to be disappointed or surprised or confused. Okay. What did you guys talk about? Okay, so you get this generational difference where older generations grew up maybe more prominently thinking about these things, and younger people maybe don't agree, but because the older generation feels this way, they have to play along, and it creates intergenerational conflict or people performing to these ideas even if they don't really believe in them. Okay, that's a really good point. Yes? Okay, so how does that relate to this issue? Where do you see otherness? Okay. Okay, so you're right. It can have legal ramifications, in fact. If you're setting these kind of clear definitions on having a cultural essence shared by a group of people, then that creates a boundary. Who doesn't have that essence? Who's not a part of those people? And if that becomes a legal issue, then it can be related to citizenship, to rights, to things like that. And we'll actually hear more about that specific issue from Liz, I'm hoping, in week 3. Any other thoughts? Yes? Oh, interesting. So it can create kind of hard boundaries between cultures, right? Expectations where, as a Japanese person, I must act this way, I must behave this way, right? Because that is our cultural essence, right? And that can cause problems in interaction with other cultures or in living in other places. Yeah, that is a possibility, yes. It's true. You can feel a sense of being controlled by this kind of thinking. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, it's a very conservative perspective, because if you're saying there's this unchanging cultural essence, then you're going to protect that essence from changing. You're going to say, oh, well, we can't let in new ideas or new types of people because that goes against what we consider this traditional core. So absolutely. Going back to what you were saying about being controlled, I don't want to say that this is a kind of brainwashing, but I do think that there's a fair point to what you're saying about this having an effect on people's lives. When I was teaching at a university in Tokyo, I've had students who were preparing to study abroad in the US. And more than one student told me something to the effect of, oh, I really need to learn how to wear a kimono so that when I go to America, I can represent my culture and teach Americans how to wear a kimono. And I was like, okay, but is that a part of your life? And they'd say, well, no, but it's a part of Japan. And so I'd kind of try to steer them, well, what about, instead of kimono, isn't there something that you actually do, that you actually enjoy, that you could introduce? And trying to break people out of this kind of, these set categories of like kimono and origami and martial arts and Japanese cooking, right? That there are other possible ways to express being Japanese or having an identity that don't necessarily fall into these traditions and that don't necessarily have to be performed for people outside of your country. A few of the other things that I wanted to mention, and I think that you got to these pretty well in your comments and your discussions. So it has a homogenizing effect inside Japan, right? That by saying that there's one essence to Japanese people, people who don't fit with that then end up categorized as outsiders. And also this perspective of uniqueness often becomes isolating, right? There's a sense of, because Japan is so unique, only Japanese people can truly understand Japanese culture. I've heard the argument that only Japanese people can truly appreciate Japanese food, for example. But this is a very isolating argument, right? If no one will ever understand you, if no one will ever really get you, why should anyone try? Right? And it also creates this excuse. If someone is critical of Japan, and that person is not Japanese, then you can say, oh, well, you're not Japanese, you'll never really understand. And so there's no space for those criticisms to be made. So let's get into kind of tying all of this together. Yes? Sure. That's a really interesting question. I think that my TA is smiling because she has personal experience in this affair, and hopefully she'll be willing to tell us. Do you want to speak to this? You don't have to.
In my own personal experiences, obviously it's not a universal rule at all by any means, but anecdotally speaking, I can say that I have personally experienced the idea that because I'm not 100% ethnically Japanese, because I wasn't raised in Japanese culture, because I wasn't raised speaking Japanese, that my relatives don't consider me to be as Japanese as they are, for sure. They always compliment my chopstick usage, like I wasn't raised by their brother, who also uses chopsticks. So just stuff like that. Oh, you know something Japanese? It's amazing. How do you know? Because I study it professionally. So that's my experience.
So yeah, absolutely. This experience of having some Japanese heritage, but not necessarily being, someone who grew up in Japan and was raised by two Japanese parents and these things, has an impact on people when they confront this kind of ideology. And there are cases of people being discriminated or just told, you're not Japanese enough, right? Yesterday, I introduced the 2015 Miss Universe Japan, who, despite being a beautiful, beautiful woman, of course, she won Miss Universe Japan because her father is African American. She got a lot of criticism online for not being traditionally Japanese in terms of like she didn't represent a traditional model of Japanese beauty. And she actually grew up in Japan. She lived in Japan, I believe, until high school. So she speaks fluent Japanese, and she's very at home in the culture. But even despite all of that, there are people who have pushed back against her specifically for not being Japanese enough. So yes, that is a thing. Other questions before I get into wrapping things up? Okay. So to try to tie our three key terms together, Orientalism posits that the West and the East are opposites, right? And that only the West gets to be modern. So because Japan is not in the West, this puts it in an impossible position, right? If Japan wants to be recognized for being modern, it can't because it's Western, but it doesn't want to be recognized as being Asian because it sees itself as being modern. And so therefore, this ideology emerged as a third possible option, a way to say that Japan is modern, but not Western because it can be unique. So there are upsides to this, right? It allows Japan to come from a position of pride, to say, we did modernize, we are special. And of course, there are unique aspects of Japanese culture, right? It would be wrong to deny that. Just as I said, it's not problematic every time a woman wears kimono, right? Japan has traditions. Japan has unique history and unique culture, and those are all things that can be celebrated. But turning that into a discourse of uniqueness, right? Of a unique cultural essence, has these problems of homogenizing Japan, of isolating Japan, and of feeding into this idea of Japan as uniquely weird, right? Once you've accepted this position of Japan being unique, then it's very easy to say, oh, well, you know, it's the unique country where they make anime tentacle porn, right? And then that feeds into this discourse of weird Japan. So it's important, I think, to emphasize Japan is not the only country that produces weird things. I know we all know that, but my favorite, fairly recent example is Pickle Rick. I don't know if there's any Rick and Morty fans in here, but this is a scientist who turned himself into a pickle in order to avoid family therapy, and then built a cybernetic body out of dead rat parts. So America can do weird stuff too, as I hope you noticed in the beginning as well with the Juggalo documentary. Yes? Yes, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about this next week. There's an actual effort coming out of Japan to promote Japanese culture abroad so that more people will be aware of it and more people will like it. But what they're trying to do is say, like, look, we're unique. We have these beautiful traditions. We have this amazing pop culture. And what they're getting instead is, look, they're unique. They marry video game girls. They have sexy body pillows. They watch anime porn. So there's this conflict that's going on, I think, between the Nihon Jinran that the Japanese government is actively trying to promote in the sense of a unique, vibrant culture, versus this kind of discourse around Japan as just weird. Not necessarily cool, not necessarily fun, but just perhaps perverted or bizarre or childlike or foolish. Yes? There is a sense of that. I won't say that all Japanese people feel that they're being controlled and that they have to act a certain way, but I think that by creating a sense of this is good Japanese culture, this is correct Japanese culture, this is the Japanese culture that we're trying to brand and market abroad, I think there is a kind of pressure there to say this is how you should be sharing your Japaneseness, performing your Japaneseness to foreigners. And I think we'll probably see a fair amount of that when the Olympics comes around and things like the opening ceremonies. So yeah, I think that's a good point. Okay, other final thoughts beyond Pickle Rick. It's not just about saying that a culture is weird, right? But even calling another culture more traditional or more spiritual or more in tune with nature, these are also not necessarily harmless, right? These often can be read as less modern, less technological, less developed, less urban, right? And that's not necessarily a positive thing, right? So we have to be very careful when we think about the generalizations that we make about other cultures, right? Particularly when they start to reference things like these Orientalist tropes, right? Because all of these have this kind of hidden opposite to them, right? And so there's a question of which side really is more positive. Third, if I said Japan was the only country that had this nationalistic sense of being unique, that would be creating one more Nihon Jinron. In America, for example, we have American exceptionalism, right? We have this idea that it's fine for America to have military bases in countries all over the world because America is the best and the strongest. But it wouldn't be fine for any other country to do that or for another country to have military bases inside the US, right? So America has its own sense of what makes it unique and special. So this isn't just a critique of Japan. And lastly, we have to be wary of any essentialist claims or overgeneralizations of any culture, right? When we talk about culture, we have to remember that culture is made up of individuals. And in any culture, there's going to be a huge variety of individuals with different ideas, different philosophies, different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different nationalities, different genders and sexualities, different ages and physical capabilities and occupations and all of these other categories that inform who we are and what part we play in that culture and that society. So anytime we talk about a country or a culture just using a blanket statement, we're always in danger of erasing someone, right? Even if I say Japan is wonderful, Japan is spectacular, I'm still generalizing a little bit. Probably most Japanese people wouldn't hate me for doing that, but there probably are one or two who would, who'd be like, no, you need to be more honest. You need to talk about the problems, right? So we need to be very careful when we talk about other cultures that we're not creating these huge erasures with our generalizations. Okay, here's Wolverine fighting a giant robot samurai for some reason. Any questions? Yes? No, the PowerPoint will not be put on Gaucho Space. So I hope you've been taking wonderful notes. I don't mind if you take pictures of the slides, especially if there's a lot of text up there, that's fine with me, but I'm not going to put these on Gaucho Space. My advice for note-taking is at least make sure you get the key concepts at the beginning because you will need those for your papers and for the final exam. Okay, see you tomorrow.